Okay, welcome to the Tattered Cover, and thank you very much for supporting your local independent bookstore. Benjamin Runkle is a former paratrooper and presidential speechwriter with a Harvard PhD and a Bronze Star from Operation Iraqi Freedom. He has worked in the Department of Defense and the National Security Council and is currently a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee. He is here tonight to discuss and sign his new book, Wanted Dead or Alive: Manhunts from Geronimo to Bin Laden. A recent review in the Washington Times stated, "In Wanted Dead or Alive, Mr. Runkle accomplishes two seemingly contradictory feats. His colorful, fast-paced accounts of each manhunt appeal to those who enjoy a good adventure story, but his keen strategic insight provides ample material for further reflection. His writing is readable without being breezy, meaty without being ponderous. Mr. Runkle's book deserves attention from both policymakers and the general public." Please welcome Benjamin Runkle.
Thank you, Tamara, for that kind introduction. It's great to see some old friends here tonight, and I appreciate that so many others were willing to miss the kickoff of the Broncos season opener tonight to be here as well. I promise I'll be brief enough so that we'll be able to catch the second half of the game. But the scheduling conflict of football aside, I couldn't think of a more appropriate time to be discussing the subject of strategic manhunts than the day after yesterday's tragic anniversary. It's out of curiosity, let me just see, how many people here remember exactly where they were on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001? Okay, that's not surprising that everybody raises their hand. By comparison, how many people remember where they were, exactly where they were on Tuesday, September 18th, 2001? That nobody raised their hand is also not surprising. It's both a cliche and an understatement to say that 9/11 is a day that will forever be etched in the memory of all Americans who lived through it. In comparison to the previous Tuesday's events, September 18th, 2001 seems relatively inconsequential. America was still in a state of shock and mourning from the attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people, yet it was also desperate to regain some small measure of normalcy. Less than 5 miles away from where rescue crews still searched for signs of life amongst the wreckage of the World Trade Center, the New York Stock Exchange reopened for business that morning. Later, the cry of "play ball" would replace the morbid silence that had settled over empty Major League Baseball stadiums across the country. And in Washington, D.C. that morning, President Bush went to the Pentagon to meet with his Secretary of Defense and senior military leaders to review the decision to activate 35,000 reservists. As the president arrived at the Pentagon, the smell of smoke still lingered in the air, wafting over from where American Airlines Flight 77 slammed into that building's outer ring. After a gathering with some survivors of the 188 people killed at the Pentagon, and a spontaneous rendition of "God Bless America" that broke out in the Pentagon cafeteria, the president spoke to reporters. One member of the press corps asked the question that was on every American's mind: "Do you want bin Laden dead?" And President Bush replied in his Texas drawl, which I won't try and imitate, "I want justice." Quote, "There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, 'Wanted dead or alive.'" For the president's supporters, which at the time seemingly impossible now, but at the time included a large majority of Americans, the statement was a symbol of American resilience and swagger in the face of unspeakable tragedy. For the president's critics, whose ranks would swell as the war on terror dragged on in Afghanistan and especially in Iraq, the remark would come to epitomize as Bush's simplistic cowboy diplomacy. Even President Bush himself would eventually express regret over his choice of words that day. Either way, it was an iconic moment in the nascent war on terror. With those 4 words, President Bush inextricably linked the conflict in the public's mind with the fate of one man, Osama bin Laden. But in reality, his statement wasn't as dramatic as it seemed at the time. Although President Bush signed a document that day authorizing operations designed to capture or kill bin Laden, he was not the first U.S. president to do so. In response to the August 1998 African embassy bombings, President Clinton fired 75 Tomahawk cruise missiles at al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan to kill bin Laden and authorized the use of lethal force, if necessary, to capture the Saudi terrorist. Moreover, bin Laden was not the first individual to be singled out as the strategic objective of a U.S. military campaign. On May 3, 1886, more than a century before a $25 million reward would be offered for information on bin Laden's whereabouts, the U.S. House of Representatives introduced a joint resolution, quote, authorizing the president to offer a reward of $25,000 for the killing or capture of Geronimo. 30 years later, in response to Pancho Villa's deadly raid across the Mexican border into Columbus, New Mexico in March 1916, President Woodrow Wilson announced, quote, an adequate force will be sent at once in pursuit of Villa with the single object of capturing him and putting a stop to his forays. And within hours of the 1989 invasion of Panama, the administration of George H.W. Bush declared that the capture of General Manuel Noriega was their, quote, ultimate objective. In fact, the United States has deployed military force with the objective of killing or capturing an individual, one man, nearly a dozen times since 1885. Wanted Dead or Alive is a history of these strategic manhunts and the lessons America can learn from them. Now, it's a reasonable question to ask, given the headlines of the last 6 months. With bin Laden dead, why should we care about the U.S. Horse Cavalry's pursuit of Geronimo, or the Marines' hunt for Nicaraguan insurgent leader Augusto Sandino more than 80 years ago? What applicability does this have to our lives these days? Well, besides the cool adventure stories, the reality is that operations targeting individuals will increasingly be attractive to U.S. policymakers for several reasons. On the one hand, as Colin Powell noted in his memoirs, reflecting on the hunt for Noriega when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, quote, a president has to rally the country behind his policies, and when that policy is war, it is tough to arouse public opinion against political abstractions. A flesh and blood villain serves better. But beyond the American tendency to personalize conflicts, American sensitivity to non-combatant casualties and the abilities of individuals, whether leading rogue states or leading terrorist networks, to threaten U.S. interests have been magnified by the evolution of technology, especially the growth of the international media and the diffusion of weapons of mass destruction and the increased lethality of dual-use technology. At the same time, the ability of U.S. forces to lethally target individuals with precision-guided munitions will make such operations increasingly tempting. Thus, rather than make war on populations, there will be a strong motivation to kill or capture individual or rogue leaders who threaten our national security. Given the probability of future strategic manhunts, it's therefore important to draw some lessons learned as to why some campaigns succeed or why some fail, or why, for example, it took 13 years to get bin Laden, when the average successful manhunt prior to that was only 18 months. Based upon the 125 years of American manhunts I examine in Wanted Dead or Alive, I come to 4 counterintuitive conclusions. First, although U.S. forces almost always enjoy an edge in technology over their quarry, this advantage is rarely decisive. Ever since General Nelson Miles erected heliograph stations throughout the area of operations in the Geronimo campaign, U.S. forces have attempted to leverage their relative advantage in technology. Yet even in recent manhunts in which we've deployed incredibly sophisticated intelligence and reconnaissance assets, sensors, and satellite technology has only played a peripheral role. Neither Saddam or bin Laden was located by drones, nor were their voices, or that of al-Qaeda and Iraq leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi for that matter, their voices were never captured by signals intercept. The reality is that for every technology there is a countermeasure, or as former Delta Force commander Pete Blaber argues, quote, the reality and complexity of life virtually guarantee there will never be an all-purpose technological panacea for finding people. My second conclusion is that more troops do not guarantee success. This is probably my most surprising or controversial conclusion, as it's become conventional wisdom that the reason bin Laden escaped from Tora Bora in 2001 was because the Bush administration failed to deploy enough U.S. troops. Yet the history of U.S. strategic manhunt suggests additional troops are not a guarantor of success. The punitive expedition against Pancho Villa deployed twice as many troops, 10,000, in pursuit of Villa as the Geronimo campaign, which used 5,000 troops, which at the time was a quarter of the United States Army, over exactly the same terrain. Yet it was the earlier, smaller manhunt that was successful, and then only because a party of 5 successfully tracked the Apache leader and convinced him to surrender. Similarly, the hunts for Noriega and Mohammed Farah Aidid in Somalia both involved roughly 20,000 troops pursuing an individual in an urban environment, yet one succeeded where the other failed, suggesting that troop strength is not the decisive variable. Also, one could also point out that small U.S. advisory teams not large deployments, were what instrumental to the capture, the successful hunts for Che Guevara and Pablo Escobar.